author in conversation with Chinmay Tumbe, and we're going to be discussing his latest work, Age of Pandemics, especially in the context of the one that we're already going through. So just a quick introduction for our speakers today. So Chinmay loves to laugh and learn, and he's passionate about migration, cities and history, and is currently a faculty member at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. He's an alumnus of the London School of Economics and Political Science, the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, Ruia College in Bombay, and Rishi Valley School. He's also been a faculty member at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Hyderabad. He was a 2013 Jean Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence and the 2018 Alfred D. Chandler Jr. International Visiting Scholar in Business History at the Harvard Business School in Boston. His first book, India Moving, A History of Migration, was published in 2018, and this is his second book. Thank you so much for joining us, Chinmay. Our moderator for this evening is Somak Ghoshal, and it's nice to see him again with us. Somak is a writer, editor, and journalist interested in the arts, culture, and human rights. Thank you both so much for taking the time out and joining us for City Scripts. And over to you, Somak. It's all yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to talk to Chinmay today because I've been a big admirer of his work, his earlier book as well. And this one I especially enjoyed because obviously, pandemic has kind of thrown us into the sort of deep end of things, and we want to understand as much of it as possible. And a long historical perspective is what this book offers us, also with very vivid and sort of humane details, which kind of makes the whole sort of current situation more and more real to us, I felt. So before I actually begin talking about the book, I want to ask Chinmay actually when he started writing this book, like how did it come about? And it's as if written on the heels of time, you were sort of probably writing it in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Somak. Firstly, thanks for having me over. Privileged to be at IIHS event and with you. I remember the first time I came across the word pandemic was during my PhD days in Bangalore, actually, when I drew this map, of population growth rate. I was doing my PhD on migration, and I drew this map of population growth rates from 1911 to 1921. And that's when I realized that this was a strange decade of Indian history where the population of India actually fell. India's population has rarely fallen. And kind of that map really, left a memory. And all I said that time was, influenza pandemic and so on. And then last year, when the WHO announced, I think the real trigger was, March 11th, when the WHO announced the pandemic, declared it as a pandemic, COVID-19 as a pandemic. I actually tweeted something on influenza because I had been reading a lot about influenza, and I kind of, I had that map in mind. And that got a lot of traction on Twitter. And a lot of people said, nobody's really heard about this. And 20 million deaths, or those are my numbers, but even if you don't accept my numbers, the estimates now range between 10 and 20 million. However you look at it, this is India's greatest demographic disaster ever on record. And surprisingly, in March back, the kind of forwards we were getting on WhatsApp was nothing will happen. The kind of stuff we're listening to as now, the hygiene hypothesis and so on. And there's this whole thing about, India never having pandemics in the past. And that really kind of, triggered this thought process that maybe this has not been well articulated enough, that we were really slaughtered for about a century, thanks to cholera, plague, and influenza. And so really March is when the seeds of the book project was sown in. And that's why, a famous historian said once, all history is contemporary history, which means we write with the concerns of this time. And that's why the book came out in 2020 and, not in 2019. It's really COVID-19 which, forced me to write this book.
Right. I was very fascinated actually by, the historical parallels that I noticed in your book and with our times. And towards the end, you actually chart out 4 stages of the age of pandemics. And I love this very coherent kind of, theory that you have of the age of pandemics, this 100-year period. And you say these are denial, confusion, acceptance, and erasure. And to me, what's fascinating is, in spite of my, abiding interest in history as a very lay reader, as a journalist, I have never ever come across a coherent narrative of the 1918 influenza pandemic or, the plague pandemics that sort of, slaughtered us, as you said earlier. What is this sort of source of forgetting? Why have historians chosen to forget these pandemics?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think historians around the world have kind of woken up because 1918 was not just India, it affected a lot. And it has, people who have written on influenza and they're focused on their countries. Crosby called it, Alfred Crosby, the historian, called it the forgotten pandemic. So it's almost a given that if we start talking about 1918 in particular, it's this forgotten pandemic. And across the world, people are asking, how did we forget? There were more deaths than the world wars. There were more. This was a large shock for most countries of the world, not just India. And then if you count of plague, which is there for about 20, 25 years, and cholera, which is there for about 100 years, it's really striking. The way I look at it, first is, of course, there is no clearly identifiable enemy. I think we remember stuff when we have a clearly identified enemy. So this is a virus, bacteria, we don't really understand it. Unless, like now, of course, many people blame China. But even then, I think that will kind of pass. And it's quite like, we think we are living in 2020. We feel that we will never forget this. This will always go down in history. My sense is, in the 80s, 60 or 80 years down the line, when all of us are long gone, people, and if say there's no major pandemic in interim, it's quite likely that this entire cycle of forgetting will happen again because there is no commemoration. We have, I remember in 2019, there was a 100-year commemoration of the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy. And this is happening in April 1919, when a few hundred, Indians died at the orders of General Dyer. Yet a few months before that, 20 million Indians died. Right? I mean, a few hundred, but 20. But we all know about the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy. We commemorate it. But, there's literally nothing on the influenza 100 years. So I think that's the reason number one. It is not easily identified. Even within the class of other mass mortality events, I think pandemics are unique because they destroy labor or bodies, but not really capital or infrastructure. So forget wars, think of floods or think of an earthquake. That is still there in some memory because there are images or paintings of broken structures. Pandemic, almost by definition, unless a pandemic starts off a war and riots, which has happened in the past. But otherwise, pandemics are very silent. They're kind of silent killers. It's just bodies going, no building is falling. So that's the other thing. And that's why it's been very tough to capture this in history. Now, in particular case of Indian history, I think we've just looked at 19th and early 20th century as British rule, right? So this was the rise and fall of British rule. And so if you look at our history textbooks, this is the dominant historiography. And what I found while researching for this book is actually, for both the British and the Indians, the day-to-day terror was actually infectious disease. So when we read our history, it feels like people must have been living under this British tyranny and looked at the British as these enemies. Maybe, but I think both the British and the Indians, on a very day-to-day kind of basis, were just trying to eke out a living amidst an age of pandemics. And for me, it's remarkable that this entire, I would say, the dominant narrative of this 100 years is actually one of pandemics. And kind of completely remarkably, wiped out.
It's pretty interesting because, the scientific literature and the scientific history of pandemics is quite well recorded, as it were. But when it comes to social sciences, we have this strange kind of gap. Is it because, like social science as a discipline may not have had the apparatus or the paraphernalia to deal with all this in the, say, early years of the 20th century? Or, is it because of a kind of lacuna in the discipline itself?
I think there are two disciplines which ought to have written more about this. One is, of course, historians or history, and the other is the medical science field. I think both in India have kind of, lagged behind. I mean, I'll tell you an example, like the Sanitary Commissioner in 1918 in particular, he wrote saying people will never forget about what happened this year. But the fact is people forgot. I mean, most people don't know what happened. So people who lived through those times didn't write enough in the medical science field. I'll bet you that most people in the medical science field might have a very cursory idea of what is cholera, plague, but they probably don't really know the kind of social and economic impact or the larger impact these pandemics had as events back then. So that's, I think, one lacuna in our system that we don't really have, especially a field like medical history. I mean, the leading works on medical history of India are written by people outside India. So, that's an unfortunate thing. The other discipline is, of course, history. And I think if you look at what's happened in the last 70 years of history writing, it's basically been a political project, right? It's about, what we learn in schools is anyway political history. We learn very little of social history or economic history. But if you look at even like, the narratives being crafted, it is a huge battlefield on politics, right? And even if when it departs from politics, it's some stuff like, capitalism, communism, socialism. But medical, I mean, this pandemic is kind of an interesting in between, which has been slipping through the cracks of social sciences things. I would say though that, it's not the case that nobody has, I mean, obviously there has to be books written on plague, cholera. David Arnold has this wonderful book on India. But I think it has not really been out there, especially in the popular discourse. And that's one of the things that this book is trying to do.
Right. I mean, I was actually referring to the history that we read in schools, for instance. Growing up, the history books never mention these big pandemics. We know the Mahamaris that sort of struck India from time to time, but those are again sort of referred to in a very abstract and, like apocalyptic way, rather than as concrete incidences, which.
Yeah, and just to give an example of like our political history, what I realized after writing this is I can never think now of the 1857 uprising without acknowledging that it happened. In a way, a spark of it, was a massive cholera outbreak which happened in the early part of 1857. Or you can't really think of people like Tilak, Gokhale, Sardar Patel, who was the head of the Ahmedabad municipality fighting plague. That was his first big political task. So a lot of our freedom leaders also actually, cut their eyes in pandemic management. And Gandhi's rise in 1919, which really comes onto the national stage, 1918-19, I would say is a huge part of it was the fact that, there was mass misery with that particular pandemic. So if you look at key markers of a freedom movement, 1857, the rise of the Congress and the split of the Congress, which, as I pointed out in the book, happens in the year of mass plague mortality, 1907. And then the rise of Gandhi, three important parts of the freedom movement are kind of bookended by pandemic outbreaks, which is another completely alternative way of looking at the freedom movement.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Also the World War. I mean, you just don't believe that, the war was kind of coming to its end and it was kind of bookended by this huge catastrophe, as it were. What I find more interesting as well is the idea that, the colonial rulers who had a sort of long exposure to pandemics, the plagues of the medieval ages and all, didn't quite sort of grapple with it as efficiently as they could have. And part of the sort of, the failure I feel is inherent in the idea of how they conceived of the public sphere, and the concept of public health, as it were. Would you like to talk about this idea of, the public in the colonial era and how it kind of manifested through these pandemics?
Yeah, that's actually a great point that you raised. I think one of the things that's very clear is in this particular time period. I mean, if you ask this question, is Western medical science, Western, say, what we call as the bacteriological revolution, late 19th century and so on, is it superior to other medical systems? I would say yes, on certain dimensions, yes. I mean, if you have cancer, you're going to particular doctors, you're not really going to Ayurvedic doctors. There are particular kind of advantages of these, different medical systems, but there is no doubt that certain advancement in science definitely happened in the late 19th century. But the funny thing is, between 1817 and 1920, is the major period, much of this scientific knowledge, or what the British or other imperialists were claiming as superior technology, were not very effective in curtailing these pandemics. And even when they could have, like they kind of abolished, kind of banished cholera from their scene after they found out that cholera was waterborne. But the officials in India were steadfast in this dogma that cholera is not a waterborne disease. These are British officials in India negating their own kind of theories, which are emanating from Britain, saying, we are not, we don't think cholera is waterborne. And, millions of deaths in India could have been averted. So there was a strange, I mean, it happened at multiple levels. One is, of course, the British not caring enough for citizens and so on. This classically in 1918, when they're diverting food grain stocks for the war effort, rather than, managing nourishment in India. So there's a lot to be said out there. But, Somak, I think when you look, I mean, I always make this classic comparison. If you look, talking about the 19th and early 20th century, yes, the British, the French, the Portuguese, but there's also the princely states, right? And so princely states of India is, 40% of the landmass and 20% of the population. And that's not insignificant. And my sense is that barring one or two, let's call them progressive, rulers, say the Travancore Maharaja, or in Mysore, I would say at certain points, conveyed thing, they were as lackluster in engaging with the pandemics as so Nizam ruled Hyderabad, or the Rajputana princely states There's not much evidence that, they were very, very concerned about their subjects and the public sphere as the British. We talk about British segregating our cities and so on. Pretty much the same thing was there in Hyderabad. Pretty much the same thing was there in Jaipur. So this idea of nobility, I think that's the prism. Instead of seeing it as a colonial thing, the idea of nobility and how out of touch they were with their subjects. I think there were very few parts of India in which there was a conscious effort to deal with the pandemics. And so for one example is this Maharaja Travancore, who's interested in this waterborne theory of cholera. And he's reaching out to officials in India saying, tell us more about this. And then we want to invest in clean drinking water. And I think a lot of this early public health investment in Kerala, goes from such enlightened efforts. You might think of Baroda maybe, but the bulk of India, colonial, non-colonial, I think there's a big distance because there's no doubt that those pandemics did disproportionately affect the poor, right? And like I mentioned in the book, even in Europe, when these pandemics kind of take root, often it's almost seen by the elite as a cleansing drive, saying that this is ordained by God to basically get rid of population, almost like a weird kind of a demographic explanation as to why these things are happening. So that's an added layer of why people are kind of ignoring it. And it's not a surprise that with the democratic revolution in the 20th century, there's been much more honest engagement of the state with citizens. And maybe that's why we get better or quicker responses to pandemics than what we got in the past.
Right. I was reading this book and constantly thinking that this kind of imperial boast about bringing modernity to India kind of comes to a, stop here because they just couldn't manage the medical health, the public health situation when the pandemic struck. So all that boasting about modernity and bringing science and, enlightenment to the natives kind of, met with an end.
Yeah, I mean, like if you just look at one indicator, called the case mortality ratio, which is very important. Like for cholera, it was more than 50%. So if you got cholera, there's a 1 in 2 chance that you die. And this number for about 80 years is the same in India. But in Britain, it's fallen. They've understood how to deal with some basic health and they've kind of prevented cholera. What's really interesting for me, Somak, is many of these things, it's not that, the British would blame the Indians, saying these guys are too filthy, they're not willing to change. They have this whole sanitation hypothesis and so on. But the fact is there were a lot of British officials in India who was, steeped in science, in what they would call as modern science, who were objecting the cutting edge theories of those times. And so that is the thing. It's not just the Indians saying, we're going to stick with our superstitions and practice and we're not going to deal with anything. It's the British in India who are not actually implementing what is actually cutting edge at that time. And so there are all sorts of these, very interesting contests happening even within the British Empire. Because as we're discovering now with COVID-19, one of the things with a new pandemic or, something unexplainable is that there's so many conjectures. Right now, this thing about COVID-19, why is it that, this mortality is more in some places than others? Same debates, on cholera, plague, and this, everyone had their own pet theory. And it's interesting that, in India, the British were very late to recognize some of the theory. For example, in plague, the British dismissed this whole idea of plague as being rats to rat fleas to humans, which we now know is like a classic transmission mechanism. And between 1896 and 1905, they in fact dismissed somebody, this guy called Simon gave this idea. They dismissed that theory, the British officials, saying that, this is a crazy theory. And then they found out, no, that's actually how plague works. And, the cover of my book, for example, is this idea of, flushing houses with disinfectants to cure plague. And of course, on hindsight, none of that was required. All was required was rat proofing or, cutting the transmission from rats to rat fleas and so on. What's also interesting, Somak, is that I think a lot of the Indians also kind of saw the benefits of it, also kind of inspired Indians to move into such science. And while we don't really have good evidence in this particular period, just after 1920s, there's also a generation of Indian scientists who kind of who get into this field precisely to solve the basic problems of the day. And so the book talks about this guy called Shambhunath Dey, who not many people know about. Many people say he ought to have got the Nobel Prize. And his cutting edge work in the 1950s on cholera actually finally solved the puzzle of cholera. It was like a 150-year puzzle as to how did cholera really kill us. And this guy, Shambhunath Dey, working in these labs in Calcutta, kind of figures it out. So if you look, I have these pictures in the book, some of the key players in the cholera war against cholera. And it starts with this John Snow, who figures out that it's waterborne, mostly waterborne. And then there's Robert Koch, who sees it, who is a German fellow, who sees it under the bacteria. And then there's Leonard Rogers, who discovers this intravenous treatment. Cholera is about dehydration, so he figures that it's about rehydration. And Samuna Day really pieces it all together. And the big, and today, if you and I get cholera, we literally have just to take a few salts, what is known as oral rehydration therapy. And the case fatality ratios are absolutely negligible. So it's gone from over 50% to virtually zero. But it's kind of incremental science and a lot of Indians who have contributed to this in that process. So I think it's not just about the fact that in those colonial times, not only did it barely work in pandemic management, but the actual end of many of these things came from Indian knowledge, which is also very interesting.
Actually, I was coming to Shamunnath Dey because he's such a fascinating character.
Yeah.
And so when you write about the Indian medical service and the doctors, and I was constantly looking for Indian names, and there weren't many. Do you think this hasn't been recorded enough, like obscured by the hegemony of colonial hegemonies, or is it because there really weren't any Indian contributors, like that many?
I poured through the Indian Medical Gazette, which is the classic journal, and of course you'll find Indian names out there. Right? But in terms of the big inventions and discoveries, not so much. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean, I think we might find out. I was just watching this on Netflix thing called The Dig, which is on archaeology. It's about acknowledgement of who finds that thing. And obviously there are names which are marginalized. In fact, Amitav Ghosh's book, Calcutta Chromosome, is precisely that. It's like this thing about, is it Ronald Ross who's really finding out this mosquito link, or is it indigenous knowledge? And he's kind of built it very nicely around that. So I think on malaria, a lot of work is happening, saying how did these people know before Ronald Ross that it was malaria based? But I think some of the thing is there could be intuitive kind of knowledge, but I think the Western kind of science which evolved in the late 90s was systematic knowledge. I think that's the difference. So they might be like for example, plague. I point out in the book, traditional knowledge was to evacuate, saying if plague comes, just camp outside your house. Now they didn't know the science behind it. It turns out that these rat fleas work at night. And so actually, if you live in the house during the day, you have a very less chance of getting plague. But if you sleep out there, you're likely to get plague. And so the traditional knowledge was, they must have just observed, saying, if you're staying outside, you're not getting it. So it's something to do with the night. But the point is, this was intuitive. It worked. The British actually praised it later on, saying that if they'd done this in London in the 17th century, a lot of lives would have been, they in fact told people in London to stay at home. And a lot of people died in the 17th century. So they kind of also appreciated this knowledge. But it is intuitive. It is not this, what we call as the systematic, empirical kind of science which evolves. And so I think you'll find more and more Indians on this branch, but I think you're going to find fewer out here. But I should mention many of the Indian Medical Service British officials were born in India. So they're actually Indian-born, medical officers. And the most famous I pointed is this guy called Liston, who figures out this rat flea thing. And so I think we should build some of these, if you're building statues and so on anyways. Maybe we should build one for Liston in Secunderabad. The fact that he figured out this plague thing, I think we should maybe honor some of these.
Absolutely. And you have this sort of wonderful descriptions, like micro descriptions of things happening inside the hospitals. Like there's a moment when I think in the influenza chapter, you write that patients would just attack these nurses, the carers, from behind, like the moment they turn their backs. And that's such a vivid image. And I kept thinking about how frontline workers now are being treated, in the COVID crisis. And nothing seems to have changed as much, like the attacks on them and the suspicion and the conspiracy theories and all of that.
I think the key thing is the anxiety. The anxiety level that the pandemic brings about is so enormous. And poor frontline workers back then or now, it's crazy. And not just doctors, even mortuary workers, not typically classic frontline workers, but especially back then, they had to actually deal with disposing bodies and so on. And the numbers were much starker. So it's remarkable actually how these people voluntarily actually got into such services. I mentioned Savitribai Phule, for example, who died of plague, but she was, she started this clinic. So a lot of the kind of selfless, voluntary kind of systems also which emerged back then.
And at the same time, there's anxiety over pollution and touch, because, you have these foreign doctors sort of examining the women, and the men are just absolutely furious. Yeah. And it kind of also reminds me how, town planning was happening at the time. Like the British were trying to segregate areas, of course, in terms of race, and then in terms of, like disease and sort of keeping people away from disease. And in India, the traditional knowledge was to segregate by caste. So there's this peculiar kind of, melting pot of science and superstition and, traditional knowledge. And it's a very peculiar time, and we haven't quite sort of got over that kind of anxiety, I think, still.
That's true. I think especially in the beginning of the 19th century, it's really amazing. The British are making a lot of fun of Indian superstitions, but it's not like their science is better at that point, And I mean, it kind of gets better by the early 20th century. But 100 years before that, they're all equally bad at addressing some of these major diseases. And there are a lot of accounts of British subtly kind of adopting those same superstitions. So there's a kind of it's a world of really people. I mean, adventurers. Both the Indians, British, French, Portuguese, people who are traveling. I mean, this is also remarkable when I think of it now. Ambedkar, Nehru, Gandhi, they all grew up in the age of pandemics, right? They grew up in times of pretty much curfews, in times of, but when we read their biographies, we rarely get that sense, that it was such a horrible time to live in terms of public health, in terms of active scapegoating. Ambedkar, I have this quote in the book, Ambedkar points out, at very late, this is 1940s, that a woman in a village was burnt, literally alive, because she was suspected to get cholera, and she belonged to the then called untouchable class. And so there's clearly a lot of scapegoating which happening, which is both on race, the British blaming the Indians all the time, and among us on the caste. So it's the fact that somebody has to be blamed for. And I think it's a more generalizable thing. That is, we've seen this across pandemics around the world. So most famously in the Black Death, 14th century. The European sort of Christians blamed the Jews, and there was this whole pogrom against the Jews during the Black Death. So they kind of, and there's this whole, what's remarkable is some of these rumors actually are remarkably similar. So I point out, this rumor of poisoning wells. So you're trying to make sense of what is happening around you. And this thing about Jews poisoning wells during the 14th century Black Death was remarkably similar to, again, in Punjab during the plague, saying that the British are poisoning wells. So this idea that some source is poisoning wells, and that is why we are falling sick is remarkable. But I'll just add one more thing on, you said about segregation. I point out in the book, how a British officer kind of figures out this waterborne theory. Kind of gives proof using a village level map. And he shows that, all the upper ranking castes on one side of the village, all the lower ranking castes on one side. And he's got these two wells. And because the water source is so clearly segregated, he says only one part of the village got cholera, right? And the only people from the other side of the village who got cholera was the person who was the washerman of these other guys. And so he was giving a kind of a proof of, disease transmission through a map of residential segregation, which for me was, remarkable in terms of how one would go about doing this. But you're absolutely right, very strong segregation. And the segregation increased from the British side. Earlier they used to call it black towns and so on, but overall, the physical space of the city definitely intensified. Because one of the things the British realized by the late 19th century was they did start cutting down on mortality rates among themselves. So they had better sanitation practices, better hygiene practices, better investment in basic nutrition and so on. And so from the late, there's no mortality advantage the British have in India. They're dying in the same intensities as the Indians, which is very high in the early 19th century. But by the late 19th century, their infant mortality rates are falling. So they realize that actually, if they do certain things within their enclaves, they're fine, right? And so that's when really they start, trying to keep out from the Indians even more, because they realize that something is going right for them. Instead of ideally, just kind of exporting their practices all over the subcontinent, they kind of kept it to themselves.
It's also interesting how the immunological theory, all the kind of mumbo jumbo that we hear now, wasn't as well established as back then. Like this fact of Indians being more prone to diseases and British not being more prone because of their stronger immunity. That whole concept, that scientific structure hadn't quite emerged at the time.
Yeah, see, we are talking about a world in which when cholera first breaks out in a big way in 1817, goes around the world very soon after, people are still thinking until the 1860s and 70s that diseases are caused by impure air. Right? And so that's the fundamental knowledge system. If you and I were having this conversation in 1817, And if somebody told us that, it's some germs and something called bacteria, we would probably laugh at them. Right? We would laugh at them, actually, because that's the state of knowledge that we would have been in.
Yeah.
And yet, if you were in 1917 and you were talking about miasma and impure air, people would laugh at it, because that revolution took about 3-4 decades, but it was very powerful. And yet in 1917, a year before influenza, people thought influenza was bacterial. Right? So they actually thought, and they were very proud of their science. They thought there'd be no more pandemics, because they had kind of conquered, they had kind of ticked off the boxes. They had ticked off malaria, they had understood malaria, they had understood tuberculosis. So there was a lot of pride, just like how we are very proud today. We're saying, nothing bad can happen. We have good command in science. And after 1917, 1918 happened, which is the world's deadliest pandemic in recent memory. The amazing thing about that flu pandemic is that they really didn't understand what hit them until decades later, right? And so the fact that it was a virus took time. So from bacteriology moving to virology also took certain time. And who knows, we are living in a world where we're saying, coronavirus. There could be some completely new kind of cutting edge discoveries which happen in the years to come, which tell us actually that no, this was this plus certain other things, and we're still kind of groping in the dark as to how these diseases transmitting, etc., just like how they were back then. So like it kind of moved in leaps and bounds, but every time there was a pushback, and people would kind of think about why is it, because let me take cholera. The British held on to this theory that it is not waterborne, and they had a good theory. I mean, they said that look, it's seasonal. He says, why should a disease be seasonal if it is going to be waterborne? Because the water we're drinking throughout the year, right? And so it's got to do something with the environment. It's got to do something with temperature. It's got to do something with humidity, right? And so they kind of clung on to that for a very long time. So we are kind of groping the dark like that on COVID-19, right? I think we are, kind of this, I call it the Pani Puri hypothesis. That is, this fact that if you can have Pani Puri outside means, you can survive anywhere in the world. My only sense is, we still don't know. Maybe there are aspects of, what scientists call as cross-reactive immunity and so on. But the fact is that, 40 million Indians died between 1817 and 1920, when we had fairly bad hygiene standards back then. I report many of it in the book. When things were not all great, when people were still having street food back then. And so there's nothing like, nothing can happen to us. I think that's the worst kind of situation to be.
Kind of
delusion, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm actually sort of fascinated by the continuities, like the kind of continuities that you can see from reading the book. As a historian, does it surprise you that we are still kind of carrying on that legacy? Like, one of the things which struck me is that our Epidemics Act is from 1897, which is like more than 100 years old, and that's like the superstructure we use, and there have been amendments and all. But that's the legacy we are still carrying on.
Absolutely, I think in the case of, I think we just got lucky. So that since 1918, there was this flu in 1957, 1968. We did get some amount of this AIDS pandemic, but AIDS is a very different class of pandemic, very slow moving and so on. But if you look at viral pandemics, we got lucky in 1957, lucky in 1968. And then, SARS didn't really affect us, swine flu didn't really affect us. So in a way, we've kind of just been lucky, and of course, even this year, in relative terms, the mortality per capita is very low compared to what I'm describing as the age of pandemics. But definitely, the initial response was very muddled, I think, because people didn't really know. If I'm talking about February, before the lockdown. After lockdown, people started taking it seriously. But before that, nobody was really taking it seriously. And I think that's because nobody really knew what pandemics were. And that's why I say this erasure is so important. The more you erase, the more you're going to be denial mode next time around. And I think that's one of the things, again, going for America, complete denial mode. But if you took off plague, the world's biggest pandemic in terms of intensity was arguably 14th century plague. But that knocked out about 1/3 of our European population by most estimates. If you think of what happened after that, they are terrified of plague. The Europeans are absolutely terrified of plague. And they don't conquer plague. Plague hits them again and again and again for 4 more centuries. But the last time plague hit them was 1720 in Marseille, in a kind of big way. After 1720, plague hit India, Egypt, China, but it kind of never went back to Europe. And one of the things, historians argue is that, the Europeans, it's so strongly embedded in consciousness, European consciousness, that they always want to keep out plague because they've been, literally battered once before. And I do think that Black Death has been registered at some level in European consciousness. It's taught in school textbooks and so on as this crazy event in European history. Whereas for us, and when plague arrived in India in 1896 and so on, from Hong Kong, the British were terrified that it might come. And so that's why this Epidemic Disease Act was precisely in that mold, saying, let us squash this disease, right? And arguably, it is kind of over the top kind of surveillance, which I think most people would say that, some of it needs to be watered down. So there's, I think after this pandemic, what we should do is like what the British would do, have an inquiry report. For all their faults, the British have these amazing reports, which would actually criticize themselves. They had this ability to kind of do a lot of nonsense, but then have this one famine commission inquiry report, and stuff like that. Except for influenza. Influenza, they have something called a preliminary report, but I think they didn't have the guts to kind of follow through that because, there's so many people died. But for plague, for cholera, they would actually have these reports. And it's kind of incremental knowledge from those reports, which led them to kind of, better understand these diseases, which I think is some lesson to take for us. That is, look at 2020, 21 and see what are some of the good practices that happened, what are the horrendous practices that happened, and kind of have like a good manual now going forward.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking of this, the law in terms of its stringency that it invoked. And two things emerge, the patterns as I was noticing. One is the relation between commerce and pandemics. Like pandemics could have been controlled much earlier, but the interest of commerce actually furthers the disease and encourages its spreading. That happened then and happened through centuries and still happening now. And the other thing is the relation between authoritarianism and the pandemics, like how surveillance becomes a tool to kind of exert a certain kind of governance.
Yeah.
Would you have any sort of thoughts on this to share?
There's no doubt that there are very hard policy trade-offs to make. When I've been thinking through this, I keep thinking, if I was the prime minister, what would I do? Because think about it, whatever you do, it could go the other way, right? So if you're not very harsh and if it goes very quickly around, right, people are going to criticize you for not taking harsh actions. And if you take very harsh actions, then, you're going to criticize saying, don't be so harsh and so on. So you're kind of damned either way from a policymaker's perspective. But the fact is, I think, for especially poor countries with very informal systems of livelihoods and so on, you can't switch on and switch off like what the Americans or the British are doing, right? And so I think demonetization already told us that, when you switch off the economy, it takes a long time for it to come back. The pain is just too much. And that is why I'm more partial towards kind of less harsh of an economic impact. So, much more localized kind of lockdowns rather than a nationwide kind of lockdown kind of approach. There's no doubt that also you need some lockdown, right? And so this idea that in two broad schools of thought, a completely free market approach saying, let the virus go through, don't do anything. The problem with that argument is that 1918 shows us that nothing really was done. Virus went around, but when people started dying, people started falling sick, the economy tanked because nobody's going to work. So it's not the case that if you don't lock down, if you don't lock down by force, what you get is an effective lockdown because nobody wants to go outside. Right? So it's very quickly a demographic disaster does become an economic disaster as well. But if you're trying to avoid an demographic disaster, what you do get for sure is an economic disaster, right? And that's what we've basically seen last year. So I'll just say that, the way I think about this is you have to have a very good handle on what is really happening to livelihoods. And beyond a point, you just have to let go and make a hard trade-off. Because we know that if people fall through the nutrition ladder, they're going to be susceptible to other diseases. So you won't get a COVID-19 mortality, you'll have TB mortality, malarial mortality, everything else, which actually works a lot on nutrient deficiency and so on. And so that's why I think the response has to be very different. You can't really compare America and US because the response has to be very, very different. And I just say in passing that, India's response, the economic survey, points out that India's done a great job and so on, and that's a government policy document. But we should be thankful, of course, we don't have, massive deaths per capita and so on. But if you look at 200 countries of the world, where do we stand, today? And the fact is we're on the bottom half of these 200 countries on even deaths per capita. Right? Which means, I mean, if you just look at a neighborhood, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, they're all doing better than us. And on economic contraction, we are really at the tail end. We're one of the worst hit economies of the world, right? And so that tells me that, our response to COVID-19 was definitely not on the best. It was obviously not like the American response also. It was not the worst, but we're somewhere in between. Right. And I think there's a lot to learn from some of these other countries which have done this thing. And there you have two responses. You have the Chinese heavy surveillance, hard state response.
Yeah.
But you also have countries like Vietnam, you have countries like New Zealand, which are kind of early response, but then as long as you shut out international travel and then you manage the internal, that's, I think, but as I said, Somak, I mean, I think it's very, very difficult to gauge, performance of a pandemic. And there could also be factors which are completely unrelated. So like Bihar is claiming, we've done a great job in the pandemic. And this is what the officials in Calcutta and Chennai said during the plague, saying we don't have plague, we've done a great job. It turned out that plague required certain rats, certain rat fleas, and they were not there. So it's not. I mean, sometimes you just get lucky. How much of it is good policy and how much of it is luck? I think that's an important part of the story.
That's what I was thinking also. The south of India wasn't affected as badly as the north in all three pandemics, actually, cholera, plague, and influenza. And that's probably because of the climatic conditions and other sort of circumstances that are needed to breed these pandemics.
Yeah, the last time they were hit majorly was this Great Famine, 1976-78. That was South India's last demographic disaster. Influenza didn't really rip through because I argue in the book that influenza kind of interacted with the drought, and the drought really didn't happen in South India that much. And so food prices were stable in South India. So they were not that badly affected during influenza. And plague was about the rat ecology and the rat fleas ecology, and that was not suitable. And cholera did strike, but over time they kind of got a good handle on cholera. And so again, I would say they were not this thing, but I would say that there is a larger story of South, even I would say maybe even before the age of pandemics. South India has been demographically much more stable than North India. Right? Yeah. And the reasons are yet unknown. I mean, Tim Dyson does this great book on the population history of India. But South India, it seems like, has had slightly lower birth rates and slightly lower death rates, for a long time. Right? And so there is something more going on in the South-North variation in India.
Right. I think we'll soon have questions from the audience. But before that, I want to ask you something about the migrant workers, actually. And because of your work on migration, and you mentioned in this book too, how, when the cholera epidemic sort of broke out, migrants wanted to go back to their villages. And yet we sort of talk about the current, like the last year's exodus as one of the biggest. Is that because the rest were not as documented as this one was? Was it a tendency, like general kind of, population tendency to move back to their villages, even in the 1900s, when
absolutely. I mean, you'd be surprised that, what was heard on railway stations at Victoria Terminus back then in Bombay, when plague hit 1896, 98, when migrants were trying to flee the city, they had this particular saying, कि अगर मरना है तो गांव में मरेंगे. Right? And this was heard last year as well. Right? And so there is definitely a kind of psychological impact that health crises do. Because why is this happening? Because we're saying that India has basically had this economy of circular migrant workers for more than 100 years. In fact, that was my main thesis in my book called India Moving, saying that India has the world's largest and longest voluntary migration system, which is circular. People are not settling down, they're going back. Which means if you have one leg in the city and one leg in the village, and the city is seen to be the side of economic security, and the village is seen to be the side of social security. The minute the economic security is not there because your job disappears because of lockdown, and this added concern of a crisis, it's a flight to safety. Right? And so it's a classic response of pandemics to flee cities. Right? I think that's been there throughout. The difference between last year and all other pandemics in India's history is that the trains ran, right? And so that's the basic difference, that the first time that the Indian railways were shut down. And let me make it very clear. All pandemics require some migration, in the sense that if there's no mobility of either human beings or rats or the vector, the disease won't spread, as simple as that. So there is a case to be made to curtail migration. That is, if pandemics if all pandemics require migration, then to curtail a pandemic, you do need to curtail migration. But here the response is completely different, I would argue, for international vis-a-vis internal migration. Because you can shut down international migration just like that. If you just shut down airports, airspace, sea space, and that's it, you're done. Right? But with internal migration, you can't, because people can walk back home. Right? So when we shut down our international, you can't walk back from London to India.
Yeah.
You can walk back from Bombay to Bihar. Right? The state borders are very porous, and this is what we saw last year. There were checkpoints and state borders. They would just walk a few kilometers down, go ahead, and then continue the journey, because that intensity is kind of unstoppable. Now, no person from London is going to swim to India, right? But you can still walk back. And believe it or not, the British actually have documented this. When they had the same decision to make, to shut down the railways or not when the plague arrived. And the decision they took was, even if we shut down the railways, people will walk back home. They've written this, saying in their kind of decision-making finds. And so that's remarkable, right? I mean, for all their other faults, they could see this kind of classic response. And so they had those special trains when the plague came and the migrant workers went back, and they came back. 6 months later, they were back in Bombay. Half of Bombay left, 400,000 people fled Bombay of a population of 800,000. And they came back later in the year, just like how our migrants are now coming back. Right? So both the exodus and the return has been documented in the past. And so I would say last year we got the crisis basically because the Shramik trains ran 2 months late, as simple as that. The Shramik train should have run in mid-March, and we would have greatly tided over this thing. Now, the idea of the lockdown is, of course, benevolent. That is the idea of not to let the virus spread and and so on. But I do think at that point the intensity was so low, they should have just given it. And as we saw, we don't have the capacity, because we don't have the social security architecture for migrants in our cities. And that is why in any future pandemic, if you're going for a hard lockdown, make sure it's clearly in communication that you will get food, water, everything for free for the next X number of days. X actually unlimited until the lockdown is lifted. There was no communication. That was the first problem. But I would say even if there's communication, there will be a tendency for people to go back. Right? And so that's why just let them go back. That's the thing.
I think the other lesson probably is to also read history carefully, because as you said, this is very well documented.
This is very well documented. Yeah, absolutely. And when I was writing my first book, I mean, I do mention cholera, plague, and so on in my first book as well. But I mean, this even in migration history, and I think people have not taken this idea of the health crisis kind of led migration very seriously. And so I do think even people who work on migration should kind of understand what is the psychological response, which kind of drives a lot of people back home. But yeah, and one more incident I'll just point out: the Chinese during the 1911 plague shut down the railways. Right. And so that's, and they shut down the railways only for migrant workers, that is third class and fourth class passengers.
Yeah.
And it was January 1911, freezing winter, and people walked back. They got a humanitarian crisis out of shutting down the railways. So we have like two cases of history. One in which the British said, don't shut down the railways because otherwise they'll walk back. And the Chinese actually shutting down the railways and people walking back. And it's again, the difference, I'm not saying that you have to curtail migration. And you probably have to have lockdowns, but internal migration is a completely different ballgame from international migration. So that's point number one. And point number two is that the internal migration is not very easily controllable, and so that is why you have to really think through this. How do you deal with this with these migrants in a very, and India has much more circular migration than most countries, right? And so that's why this particular nature of the migrant is important. Why didn't we get so many protests in Chennai or in Bangalore or Hyderabad? All the protests seem to be happening in Delhi, Surat, and Mumbai. These are cities where more than half the migrant population comes from not only other states but other rural areas. In Bangalore, Chennai, more than half the migrants come from other urban areas. So it's a completely different class of migrants that we're talking about. Right? And so that is why this crisis really hit some places and not the others. The other point is, the source regions also became, not just the central government. The state government then after a point said, we don't want you. Right? And so that was the other kind of layer of problem. And I think that's what really hurt Nitish Kumar in the recent elections. That's my kind of hypothesis, is that a lot of people didn't see the fault at the central government level. They were upset that the Bihar state government was not allowing them to come back when some of the other states governments had started to allow. And so I think we should not kind of, see, we're saying India shuts down for the rest of the world. Then we say states should shut down for rest of the states. And then within the states, the district should shut down. And then at the village level, the villages are saying nobody can come back. Now that's a kind of a completely, a crazy kind of, if everyone's shutting out for each other, then you've got a lot of stranded people.
Right, right. And it's interesting that, like the idea of stigma, the social stigma that is attached to COVID-19, for instance, initially in the initial days, the fear and stigma, I wonder how much of it actually existed within India, as in like how neighborhoods kind of, rejected their neighbors and stuff like that.
It's two things. One thing which is different from this pandemic than earlier pandemics is that for at least some time of this pandemic, the disease was actually seen as a rich person's disease, right? And so a lot of migrants said, "Ye to like amiri."
Yeah,
it's a rich person's disease. Whereas in the past, often when pandemics would come, it was automatically blamed on poor people because it was very clear that poor people were dying in high numbers. Now, I don't think there's a consensus on what is the socio-demographic profile of COVID-19 mortality in India, right? But I've heard public health, people talking about this as an urban VIP virus. Now, I'm going to be careful and not go with that adjective. But what's interesting in COVID-19 is that actually the migrants, especially or the poor, were saying that why are people going overboard when actually we are suffering from all these other diseases. That time you didn't have a lockdown. There's tuberculosis in India, but you don't have a lockdown. But is it because the rich were affected, right, that you had this lockdown? And once it was done, then the stigma actually kind of what you're talking about, went up in middle class locality and so on, where people started, scanning of people entering, where the blame kind of shifted that these people must be transferring the disease. I just say that compared to past pandemics, this time around, the stigma was both ways. Even a lot of people who are working in, say, these neighborhoods were kind of saying stuff like, this is a disease of you people. And so it was a very, very different from what I've been observing in the past, where it was pretty much one way kind of blame game happening.
In fact, I was thinking that, like the idea that there was a vast difference in nutrition levels in the population. And probably that's why some segments got worse hit than the others, some recovered. And that's something we never sort of deal with in our social histories again. It's probably part of epidemiology and all of that, the scientific literature, but not as much as we should talk about in our social history.
Absolutely, yeah. Huge nutrition shock. And because we were so much more, see today, one of the good things about last 1 year is we are not only had good rainfall, we're sitting on, millions of tons of food grain stock. So in that sense, obviously a lot of people went hungry, but at the overall national level, there is some amount of food security, which was clearly not there in what I'm describing as the age of pandemics. And there's no doubt with every drought, every monsoon failure, you would get unnecessarily excess mortality simply because you had a situation of massive food insecurity. And so we're talking about a period, of course, even today, malnutrition in India is fairly high in relative terms, but we're talking of the 19th century when it was, really, really bad. And there's no doubt that, the gradient of mortality was very high. I mean, some of the numbers that point out, I think for plague, among the lowest ranking castes, mortality was 10 times higher than, say, the British or the Parsis, which were typically the wealthy within the city. Right? 10 times is a huge kind of a gradient in terms of mortality rates. And definitely nutrition was, one part of that story.
Right, right. So before I take questions from the audience, I just want to ask you one thing, and on a slightly lighter note, where you talk about, it's really not light because it is about circulation of rumors and, that aspect of the fake news aspect of the past that you write about. It's very interesting how cats were sort of brought in to sort of kill the rats. This whole kind of cat economy and thing grew up. Like, were there other sort of such trivia that probably didn't make into the book, or
Tons, yeah. There's just tons of stuff. When I look at my notes now for the book, obviously, this is a nightmare for any person writing a book. That is, you have a lot of material to work with. Unfortunately, I would say not for influenza. For influenza, whatever I could find is there. There's pretty much nothing. I'm sure there's a lot more, which has to be yet written. But influenza has kind of been less documented. But on plague and cholera, because it happened over much more. See, influenza is for a few months. Plague was for about 2 decades. Cholera was for a century. So there's a lot to work with, right? The way I approach the book is I first made a mortality statistical database. I'm trained as an economist, so this is what I do. I work with large numbers and so on. So I made this very morbid death statistics database, province level, from 1860s to 1940s, and cause of death. So I could see cholera, plague, fevers, and so on. And that gave me a framing device for the book, right? Because I have to pick which regions to talk about, which kind of time periods to talk about, because I can't talk of every year in 100 years on cholera and so on. And so, yes, I had to make very important choices. So wherever I could find first-person references, that was important, not to make the book overly statistical. But the statistics are important. And so there's a lot of statistics also in the book. But I'm trying to think of, certain sort of incidents. I think a lot of things from novels. They have been kind of references to novels. I could have put in a lot of Ronald Ross and the malaria story, but malaria was not the focus of the book. So that is an important thing about how this, how he thought it was a mosquito-driven thing. I could have brought in, again, Calcutta Chromosome, which is Somak Ghoshal's novel. A lot of things about smallpox as well, because smallpox is not part of this book, but smallpox is actually the disease which is getting a lot of attraction on vaccination, on public health. Now I think I should have written a bit more on vaccination, because we are now at a phase of the pandemic where vaccination is a big deal. Yes. And for example, I could have mentioned, so one trivia is, like today's hero is, Adar Poonawalla, right, of Serum Institute. Yeah. But the trivia is, how it's linked to the age of pandemics. It's not like the Serum Institute came out of the blue. The Poonawallas are a family of horse breeders, and Pune-based horse breeders, and they had nothing to do with vaccines. But they were supplying the serum, horse-based kind of stuff, to the Haffkine Institute in Bombay. Right? And the Haffkine Institute is named after Valdemar Haffkine, who gets prominent mention in the book. Comes to India in late 19th century to start a vaccine on cholera, and then he's persuaded by the government to stay back for plague. He's implicated in a scandal on vaccination, which unfortunately kills a few people. Then he's cleared of the charges. So 20-year eventful life in India of this Odessa-born scientist. And in his honor, that Bombay Bacteriology Lab is now named as the Haffkine Institute. And if you go to Bombay, it used to be the governor of Bombay's house, which is a palatial kind of monument. And that's where the Haffkine Institute is. And the Haffkine Institute, in a way, kind of started off a lot of the important vaccines in India. And the Poonawallas would supply one thing, but the Poonawallas kind of did backward integration. And that's how they got into vaccination. So in a way, the age of pandemics is very closely linked. Where if you get your shot, you should know that you could not have got this shot from this company without a guy called Haffkine.
Yeah, I mean, the anecdotes are just priceless. I was so thrilled by all these little details that you put in. So there's a question for Chinmay. I'm just going to read it out for everyone. From a research perspective, when you say pandemics are well documented, do you also consider literary accounts like, for instance, Dante's prose, other literary works of the 14th century Black Plague? How reliable do you think sources like that are, if at all?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, as a researcher, one has to look at everything. And then take a call as to, how credible these things are. For example, Daniel Defoe's Plague, one of the things people have now pointed out is that it was, a lot of it was cooked up. And so people have pointed out clearly that there's a lot of problems with the very simple literal understanding of that book. In this particular book, the literary references I work on is, for example, U.R. Ananthamurthy's Samskara, right? And Samskara technically is not in this time frame of 1870 to 1920. It's between 1920 and 1950. It's in that slot. But I loved the references to plague, and so I've gotten Samskara into the book in terms of plague. Though it's a work of fiction, but I think I don't think U.R. Ananthamurthy gets a lot of the science right. He's playing around with the things, but that's the literary. You have the leeway to do that. He likens people across centuries have written about rats coming out, spinning, and dying. That's the thing about plague. How do you know this plague? You see rats coming out, spinning, and dying, and this has been commented upon by generations of people. Right? But U.R. Ananthamurthy is a great novelist, and so the way he writes it is the rats come out like a wedding procession. So it's a wonderful way to put it, and then die. Right? So obviously, writers have that, especially novelists have that leeway. But I looked at a book called Smriti Chitra, and I quote heavily from Smriti Chitra in the book because Smriti Chitra is an autobiography of Lakshmibai Tilak. It's a Marathi autobiography written in the 1930s and translated by Shanta Gokhale a few years back. And it has an amazing first-person account of the plague and influenza. Now, when I was reading that, it felt very real, right? So I've gone with this spirit that I think what she was describing was very real. But of course, when she was writing it, it was maybe 20 years down the road. So maybe she's definitely touched up the accounts by a certain amount. But it was very, very intense. If you read Smriti Chitri, highly recommend read Smriti Chitri. Very intense accounts of both the plague and influenza. But interestingly, influenza was not called influenza; it was called Manmodi. And even Shanta Gokhale actually did not know that this was nothing but the great influenza pandemic of 1918. And so I pointed this out to Shanta Gokhale, who had translated this book, and she was very happy to know that she was trying to find out what Manmodi was for the last couple of years. And so she was very happy to know that this was nothing but this great influenza pandemic of 1918. So I have used literary references. There's a book now which translated last year, Bengali book, A Ballad of Intermittent Fever, if I'm not mistaken. And it's again a lovely book. It's a novel. I do think some of the science is not completely spot on and so on, but I think I would highly recommend this book. It's about 4 generations of physicians in Calcutta, and again you get a flavor of cholera, plague, influenza, and stuff like that. So there are some interesting literary works in India, and one of the things I've tried to do in the book is actually not talk too much about Dante or Defoe, but actually talk about our own literature, which has come about on this, because I don't think we've talked about it enough. Like Nirala's autobiography talks about, influenza in great detail. So I've been literally hunting for resources. In fact, if you come up, if you ever find, literary references to either cholera, plague, or influenza, please let me know, because this is not a finished, this is a book, but I would love to write more on this going forward. So in fact, I think the last page of the book mentions this, saying, if you have stories from these times, if you have a plague certificate from your, ancestors' days, please send it over.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange that we sort of look at Boccaccio and all these writers and Defoe, who actually wasn't even born when the plague had hit London. So
yeah. I'll just point out one last thing. I did find one reference, which I've completely speculated on in the book, which is in the Arthashastra. And I'm kind of obsessed about the Arthashastra. That's the one thing which was there mentioned in the first book as well as in this book. The Arthashastra actually does surprisingly mention rats. Obviously, it doesn't call it plague or anything, but it has this unusual reference to rats and what to do when there are a lot of rats. And they also have an injunction called rat tax. That is, a certain proportion of rats to be brought to the king. And this is, exactly what the colonial officials did in the early 20th century. So the fact that, you should kill rats and get it, and then you'll be paid for it. So it's just a remarkable, Arthashastra people are dating it to at least 1800 years back. So I have just speculated wildly, that hopefully people who work on ancient India might pick on this and other things, and because it's quite likely that plague has been endemic in India. And there's also a reference, since you've talked about literary references, I think the Bhagavata Purana also mentions this rats coming out and dying. That's the reference we're all looking for plague. And then, of course, it's there in the 17th century Jahangir Nama, which I've kind of quoted in the book. So there are these references even in Indian history. And I think what the pandemic will do, obviously, now is that historians working on different time periods, especially on India, will try and look for references. And so we might learn more. Different texts in ancient India might have mentioned some of these things.
Maybe a history of rats in India.
Yeah, history of rats.
There's a question from Sophia. Do you think that the history of pandemics and diseases should be part of our academic syllabus, considering that COVID-19 is being talked about as the worst pandemic? But people, especially in India, have survived bigger pandemics when medical science was not as advanced as today.
So it's a great question, Sophia. And my book actually has 2 arguments. One is that this is a period which is 1870 to 1920, which has typically been studied in the framework of capitalism, globalization, imperialism, whereas I'm saying that, this was also an age of pandemics. And the second argument of the book is precisely what you're saying, is that we need to bring in pandemics as part of a collective memory, and we need to start talking more about it and kind of understand, not like forget it, 40 years down the line or 50 years down the line, and so on. Now, how can this be done? Now, of course, there's one, this is like this is a favorite argument for people who write history-related books. Oh, but our history textbooks don't teach us this, right? And I probably mentioned this, I'm guilty to this. I might have mentioned this at the beginning of today's session, saying, how is it that our history textbooks have not talked about this? Well, the fact is that history textbooks are finite. You can't have, everything in a history text. So people have to make important choices. But I do think, 20 million Indians dying in a few months has to be in our history textbooks. So without a doubt, maybe not have cholera, but at least have the influenza pandemic, just in terms of the shock. I mean, that's a massive mortality shock. So definitely I'm going to be arguing that our class 10 or whatever, the class 6 to class 10 history textbooks ought to be talking a little bit about this. But this, I don't think this is actually going to happen. But I would definitely argue that medical schools, right, ought to be teaching more history and more about history of our history. Because my sense is that medical schools, they learn about Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and these great scientists who did wonderful things, but they've never really understood, the Indian story in medical history. And so I would pitch that more than our general schools, that would be wonderful. But I think medical schools in particular, ought to know, because I think, the thing about pandemics is they should be seen as events. So one is the science, which is very important. But then like the migration crisis, that's an offshoot. That's something which you would never learn in a med school. But if you had a course built on pandemics, you would then inculcate this idea that, because you'll see the advisors to the prime minister were all epidemiologists, right? Who are arguing for a lockdown, etc. Now, these epidemiologists had a training in history saying that, if you do this, you also get a migration crisis. You would have probably got a very different kind of a communication in the lockdown speech. So that's why my emphasis is more on medical schools than general schools, which anyway our children are just overburdened with a lot of facts and figures. So that's how I see it. But definitely, and I should just point out, Sophia, that I have just finished teaching a course at IIM Ahmedabad, which is a management school called Pandemics, right? And so I have started this thing. The question is, should it be part of our academic syllabus? I offered this as an elective. And it kind of worked out great. It's a short 10-session course. And since I'm in a management school, the emphasis was more on the connection with business, economy, society, and so on. And we had 5 sessions on the history and 5 sessions on COVID-19. And it was a fun kind of a course. So I do hope more kind of institutions start, teaching either as an elective or in the core syllabus. But again, I would emphasize medical schools have to start.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much. I don't know if there are any more questions. Well, if there aren't any more questions, then probably we will just conclude the session. Thank you, Chinmay. It was a real pleasure talking to you. And we hope to read next probably the history of rats.
Thank you, Somak. And what are you working on? What's your latest project on?
Just my usual journalism. It's a tough time for journalists. So that's what.
Okay.
Great. This was really lovely and really enlightening. And thank you for answering our questions. And thank you for being a part of Series Scripts. We hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.